You should be grateful, her aunt said, pinning the veil into Clara's hair with cold, efficient fingers. At least someone is willing to take you. Clara stared at her own reflection and felt nothing, not rage, not grief, only the terrible stillness of a girl who had already understood that nobody in this room was going to save her. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The morning of Clara Whitmore's wedding, she woke up before dawn and lay perfectly still in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the room she had slept in since she was 4 years old, counting the familiar cracks in the plaster the way she had done 1,000 times before. She counted them because she knew she would never count them again. By nightfall, this room, this house, this life would belong to someone else. By nightfall, so would she. She was 18 years old. Her father had been dead for exactly 43 days. She knew the number because she had been counting those days too. Thomas Whitmore had been a decent man, not a wealthy man, not a powerful man, but a decent one, and in Montana Territory in 1882, decency was its own kind of currency. He had taught Clara to read ledgers before she could properly read novels. He had shown her how to check a contract for hidden language, how to spot a number that didn't add up, how to ask the questions that men in suits hoped young women would never think to ask. He had raised her to be sharp because he understood, in the quiet way that loving fathers understand things, that a woman without sharpness had nothing to protect herself with. And then one frozen February morning, his heart simply stopped. He was 41 years old. There was no warning. There was no goodbye. There was only Clara, standing at the kitchen doorway, watching her father slumped sideways in his chair, his coffee going cold beside his hand. And the sound that came out of her mouth was not a scream. It was something smaller and more permanent than a scream. A sound she had never made before and prayed she would never make again. The debt came later. The relatives came even later than that. Clara had not known about the debt. That was the cruelest part. Her father had hidden it from her the way good fathers hide the worst things, not to deceive, but to protect, to give her one more season of believing the world was manageable. He had borrowed against the farm to survive 2 bad harvests, and then borrowed again, and the notes had come due in March, and Thomas Whitmore had died in February, and the timing of it felt almost deliberate in its brutality. Her aunt and uncle arrived from Billings 3 days after the funeral, and they moved through the house with the brisk efficiency of people who had already made their decisions before they got there. Her Aunt Ruth was a narrow woman with a narrow mouth that seemed designed to say uncomfortable things in a comfortable tone of voice. Her Uncle Gerald said very little but nodded constantly, as if nodding were a form of agreement with whatever the universe had already arranged. "The farm has to go," Aunt Ruth said on the first evening, sitting across from Clara at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "The creditors won't wait. We've spoken with Mr. Aldridge at the bank, and the situation is quite clear." "I can work the farm," Clara said. "I know every inch of it." "Father taught me, Clara." Her aunt said her name the way someone sets down a heavy object, final, flat, done. "You are a girl alone. A girl alone cannot work a farm, cannot manage creditors, cannot protect property. This is not cruelty. This is simply how the world works." Clara looked at her uncle. He nodded. She looked back at her aunt. "Then what happens to me?" Ruth set down her teacup with a precise little click. "We have made arrangements," she said. "Fortunate arrangements, actually. A man has agreed to take you." The word take landed somewhere between Clara's ribs and stayed there. "Take me," she repeated. "Marry you. There is a man, a rancher, up in the northern valleys. Samuel Carter. He is established. He has land. He is not." Ruth paused in the particular way people pause when they are choosing between honesty and strategy. "He is not what you might have hoped for. He is older. He keeps to himself. People find him unusual. But he has agreed to the arrangement. And frankly, Clara, in your situation, you are not in a position to be particular." Clara felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite fear, Something older than both of those things. Something that sat in the chest and pressed outward, like a stone. "Did anyone ask him?" she said quietly. "Or did anyone ask me?" Ruth looked at her with genuine surprise, as if the question were a form of rudeness she had not anticipated. "We asked what needed to be asked," she said. "The arrangements are made. The wedding will be in 3 weeks. 3 weeks." Clara spent those 3 weeks in a state she could not name. She moved through her days packing the things she was allowed to take, saying goodbye to neighbors who tried to be kind, and mostly succeeded in being awkward. Walking the property lines of her father's farm in the early mornings before the world woke up. Pressing the reality of it into her memory, like pressing a flower between the pages of a book. She was trying to preserve something. She didn't know exactly what. She heard things about Samuel Carter, because small towns in Montana Territory were organisms that survived primarily on the exchange of information, most of it unreliable. He was strange, people said. He had lived alone in those mountains for so long that he had forgotten how to be around people. He was cold, he was harsh, he drank, some said, though others disputed this. He had a temper, someone whispered, though no one could provide a specific incident. He was simply wrong somehow, off, the kind of man that decent people felt uneasy around without being able to explain exactly why. Clara listened to all of it and felt the stone in her chest grow heavier. She did not sleep well. She did not eat well. She sat with her father's ledgers in the evenings and ran her fingers over his handwriting, the familiar, slightly cramped letters. The columns of numbers that told the story of a man working hard and falling, slightly short, and she talked to him in her head the way she had been doing since February. "I don't know what he's like," she told him silently. "I don't know if I'm going to be safe. I don't know if you'd want this for me, or if you'd be fighting it with everything you had." She thought she knew the answer to that last part. She thought about fighting it herself, but fighting required resources. She did not have money, allies, a legal standing that a girl of 18 in 1882 simply did not possess. She had her father's sharpness, but sharpness without leverage was just a knife with no handle. On the morning of her wedding, she woke before dawn and counted the cracks in the ceiling one last time. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, held in the parlor of the minister's house with Aunt Ruth and Uncle Gerald as witnesses, and no one else. The minister was a kind man who looked at Clara with an expression she recognized as concern barely disguised as professional warmth. Samuel Carter stood beside her at the front of the room. Clara had seen him for the first time only 20 minutes earlier, when he arrived at the minister's house in a wagon with a horse that was better cared for than most people's children. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of genuine labor rather than performance. His face was weathered, older looking than his 34 years, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into mountain sun and, possibly from other things she couldn't identify yet. He wore clean clothes. His boots were polished. That surprised her. She wasn't sure why it surprised her, but it did. He looked at her when she came to stand beside him, and his expression was complicated. Not unkind, not what she had braced herself for. There was something in it that might have been apology if she had been more willing to be generous. The minister read the words. Clara said what she was supposed to say. Samuel said what he was supposed to say. His voice was low and level, and he did not stumble over the words, and she had the strange impression that he had thought about them beforehand. Aunt Ruth dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, which Clara found privately remarkable, because she could not imagine what emotion was causing the tears. Uncle Gerald nodded, and then it was done. In the wagon, riding away from the minister's house, Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and stared at the road ahead and said absolutely nothing. The mountains were visible in the distance, white-capped and enormous, and she was going toward them. Samuel drove. He said nothing either. After perhaps 20 minutes of silence, he said, without looking at her, "I know this isn't what you wanted." Clara kept looking at the road. "No," she said, "it isn't." Another silence. "I won't pretend otherwise," he said. "And I won't ask you to pretend otherwise either." She looked at him then, quickly, trying to read what was underneath the words. He was watching the horse. His hands on the reins were steady. "What will you ask me?" she said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Time," he said finally. "That's all. Give the situation time before you decide what it is." Clara looked back at the road. She didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. The journey into the northern valleys took the better part of a day, and by the time they arrived at Samuel Carter's cabin and surrounding ranch, the light was going gold, and the air had the sharp, resinous smell of pine and cold water. The cabin itself was built from heavy timber, solid and practical, without ornamentation, but without the neglect she had half expected either. The outbuildings were maintained. The fencing was repaired. A hired hand named Pete, a rangy man of about 50, with a face like a kind and battered road map, came out to meet them. He greeted Samuel with easy familiarity, and Clara with a hat tipped respectfully low. "Ma'am," he said, "welcome." The word welcome hit her oddly. She had not expected it to mean anything, but it did, or at least it registered, the way a small, unexpected warmth registers when you have been cold for a long time. Inside the cabin, Samuel showed her the space without ceremony or performance, just the straightforward information of where things were and how they worked, as if she were a capable adult who would prefer utility to guided tours. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main room with a fireplace and a kitchen area, and a sleeping area behind a partition. It was clean, cleaner than she had expected from a man who lived alone. "The bed is yours," he said, when they reached the partition. "I'll take the main room." Clara looked at him. "I told you," he said, and there was something almost dry in his voice, though not unkind. "Time. There's no hurry for anything," she swallowed. She had prepared herself for a very different conversation. "All right," she said. That first evening, Samuel made a meal from things that were clearly already prepared, a pot of something that had been kept warm, bread that was fresh, which meant he had baked it that morning, or close to it. He had cooked for her arrival. He had planned for her to be fed. She sat across from him at the table and ate and said very little, and he ate and said very little, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who were trying to figure out the shape of a situation they had both been placed in, without complete consent. After dinner, she helped clear the table because it seemed like the right thing to do, and he accepted her help without making anything of it, and that also surprised her. She was starting to have a collection of surprises. Later, she sat near the fireplace. He had insisted she take the chair closest to it, and she was quiet and very tired, and the accumulated weight of the past 43 days, plus the long wagon ride, plus the wedding, plus everything else was pressing down on her with a heaviness she had been holding at arm's length all day. She did not mean to cry. She was not a person who cried easily, or who cried in front of people she didn't know, or who believed that crying in front of strangers was anything other than a form of vulnerability she could not afford. But the firelight was warm, and she was exhausted, and the grief and fear and helpless fury of the last weeks chose that particular moment to stop being manageable, and she felt her face change before she could stop it, and her eyes filled, and she pressed her hands together in her lap and stared at the fire and breathed very carefully and tried to hold it back. She could feel him in the room. She knew he was aware of it. She braced for something, discomfort maybe, or worse, pity offered in a way that made it feel like condescension. Instead, he said quietly, from across the room, "I know you didn't choose this life." She didn't look at him. "I know that," he said, "and I'm not going to pretend that knowing it changes much right now. But I want you to hear this once, and then I won't say it again unless you need to hear it again." He paused. "You will never feel like a prisoner here. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, you will have room to breathe. I promise you that." Clara pressed her hands together harder and kept staring at the fire. The tears came anyway. Not dramatically, not loudly, just the quiet, honest tears of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has finally encountered something that does not require her to be afraid, and doesn't quite know what to do with that. She cried for a few minutes, and then she stopped, and she wiped her face with the hem of her sleeve, and she said, still not looking at him, "Why did you agree to this arrangement?" A long pause. "Because they told me a girl was going to lose her home and end up with nothing," he said. "And I had room." It was such a plain answer, so without decoration. "That's all," she said. "That's enough," he said, "isn't it?" She didn't answer that night, but she thought about it for a long time before she slept. In the morning, she woke to find that the fire in the main room had already been rebuilt. He had been up before her, which, considering she had woken before dawn, was impressive. And there was coffee on, and breakfast making itself in the pan. And Samuel was outside doing something with the horses. She stood in the doorway of the cabin with her coffee and watched him for a moment. He worked the way men worked when they had been working, since before they could remember, with an economy of motion, without wasted effort, without performance. He was talking to the horse quietly, not baby talk, not the self-conscious cooing. Some people did just actual quiet conversation, as if the horse had opinions worth considering. One of his ranch hands, a young man she hadn't met yet, couldn't be more than 17, came around the corner of the barn, carrying a harness that had clearly come apart, holding the pieces up with an expression of genuine helplessness. "Boss," the boy said, "I think I made it worse." Samuel looked at the harness. Looked at the boy. "How did you make it worse?" he said. And there was absolutely no accusation in it, just honest curiosity. "I tried to fix the buckle, and then the whole left strap came off," the boy said miserably. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Samuel said. "Watch." And he took the harness from the boy and began working on it with the same unhurried competence. He applied to everything, talking through what he was doing as he did it, not lecturing, just explaining. The way someone explains a thing to a person they expect, will want to understand. The boy watched and nodded, and asked a question, and Samuel answered it without impatience. Clara stood in the doorway with her coffee going warm in her hands, and filed that moment somewhere important. That morning, she discovered that the cabin had a root cellar with organized, labeled shelves. That the chickens there, were 8 of them, had names she would eventually learn. That Pete, the ranch hand she had met the night before, had been with Samuel for 11 years and spoke about him with the quiet loyalty of someone who had chosen to stay and meant it. "He's a hard man to get to know," Pete told her, when they found themselves near the chicken coop together, collecting eggs, him without self-consciousness, and her with the careful attention of someone learning a new language. "But once you do," he shook his head slightly, "there aren't many like him." "What happened to his family?" she asked. She wasn't sure she had the right to ask, but she asked anyway. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then, mountain winter, about 8 years back. "Bad one. His folks and his younger brother. He built most of what's here after that. I think he needed something to build." He looked at her steadily. "He doesn't talk about it, but it's there. You'll see it sometimes." Clara thought about the stone in her chest, the one that had been there since February. She wondered if Samuel Carter had a stone too. She suspected he did. The days developed a shape. She helped where she could and learned what she didn't know. Samuel never assigned her tasks he offered, always as choices, always with the understanding that she could say no, always with the unstated message that she was a person deciding how to spend her time rather than a possession being deployed. When she made mistakes, which she did, because she was 18, and the life of a mountain ranch was not her previous life, he showed her the correct way and moved on. No drama, no disappointment, just the next thing. She had not been treated that way before, not exactly. Her father had been kind, but he had also carried the weight of his own worry, and that weight sometimes translated into impatience. Her relatives had been her relatives. Samuel simply treated her as if she were competent until proven otherwise, and then treated her as competent with useful additional information. She was not sure how to categorize that. She kept turning it over. 3 weeks into her life, on the mountain ranch, she found herself in the storage room, sorting provisions. Because Samuel needed to know what they were low on before the next supply run, and the inventory was thorough, and consistent, and organized in a way that told her this was a man who planned ahead and took practical things seriously. She was halfway through the flour sacks when she found a small wooden box on the back shelf, unremarkable, unlabeled. She should not have opened it. She opened it. Inside were three things: a letter in a woman's handwriting, worn from handling, a child's shoe, small and worn at the toe, and a photograph, faded, the paper gone brittle, of a family she recognized only from the shape of the man standing at the back, younger, with the careful formal posture of someone who didn't know how to hold still for a photograph. Samuel, a woman beside him who must have been his mother, a man who must have been his father, and a boy of perhaps 10, grinning at the camera with the uncomplicated happiness of a child who had not yet learned that the world could take things. Clara put the photograph back carefully. She put the shoe back. She folded the letter without reading it, that line she would not cross, and set it back where it had been and closed the box and put it exactly where she had found it. She stood in the storage room for a moment, absolutely still. Then she picked up her inventory list and kept going. That evening, at dinner, she said, "I found the box." Samuel went very still across the table. "I didn't read the letter," she said. "I looked at the photograph. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have opened it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Which shelf?" "Back left. I put it back exactly where it was." He nodded once. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. "His name was Daniel," he said after a silence. "My brother. He was 10 years old." Clara said nothing. She understood that this was not an invitation to respond. It was a man setting down something he had been carrying alone, just for a moment, just to rest. "He used to follow me everywhere," Samuel said. "I used to pretend to find it irritating." His voice was level, but it was the kind of level that takes real effort to achieve. "I didn't find it irritating." "No," Clara said quietly. "I don't expect you did." He looked at her then, directly, clearly, with something in his expression that was complicated and real. "You're not what I expected," he said. Clara kept his gaze. "Neither are you," she said. The silence that followed was different from their earlier silences. It had a different texture, not the silence of strangers figuring out the terms of coexistence, but something closer. Something that acknowledged that two people with stones in their chests had found each other on a mountain, and were not entirely sure what to make of that, but were both still there. That night, alone behind her partition, Clara lay in the dark and thought about her father, and about Daniel Carter, who had been 10 years old and followed his brother everywhere, and about the strange, uncomfortable truth that grief is one of the few things in the world that truly belongs to no particular kind of person, that it doesn't care how old you are, or how strong you are, or how alone you have chosen to make yourself. She thought, "I am not what he expected." She thought, "He is not what I expected." She thought, "I don't know what this is, or what it will become. But I am still here, and he is still here. And perhaps for now that is something." Outside the cabin, the mountain was dark and enormous and cold, and the stars over Montana Territory in 1882 were so thick and close that on clear nights you could almost feel the weight of them. Clara Whitmore, Clara Carter, though she still flinched slightly at the name, did not feel like a prisoner. She felt for the first time in 43 days plus 3 weeks, like a person who might possibly survive and what had happened to her. That was not love. It was not even close to love yet. But it was something. And in the morning, Samuel would be up before her, and the fire would already be going, and the coffee would be on, and outside the barn, the young ranch hand would probably break something else, and Samuel would teach him how to fix it. And the mountain would be there, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and Clara would stand in the doorway with her coffee and watch, and file more things in the place inside herself where she kept the important ones. And day by day, in the quiet and unannounced way that the most important things tend to happen, something was beginning. The thing about learning to trust someone was that it never happened the way you expected it to. It didn't arrive like a decision. It arrived like weather, gradually, from a direction you hadn't been watching, until one morning you looked up and realized the sky had changed, and you couldn't remember exactly when it happened. Clara had been on the mountain ranch for exactly 5 weeks when she had her first real argument with Samuel Carter. It wasn't about anything significant. That was the strange part. It started over a horse. She had been working with one of the younger mares, a skittish gray that Samuel's crew called Ghost for reasons that were self-evident, trying to get the animal comfortable with a new saddle blanket, and she had been making progress. Slow and patient progress, the kind her father had taught her when she was 12, and horses were still larger than her confidence. She had been at it for the better part of an hour, and the mare was beginning to settle, when Samuel came around the corner of the barn and said, without breaking stride, "Leave her." "She's not ready for that yet." Clara did not leave her. She kept her hand on the mare's neck, kept her voice low and steady, kept doing exactly what she had been doing. Samuel stopped. "Clara," he said, "that horse will spook. She's been unpredictable this week." "She's not unpredictable right now," Clara said, without turning around. "She's listening. She was listening to the Harrison boy last Tuesday, right up until she put him into the fence post." "I'm not the Harrison boy." A silence. She could feel him standing behind her, calculating something she couldn't quite read. "Step back," he said, and there was something different in his tone now. Not commanding, exactly, but with an edge to it that she recognized as genuine concern, which somehow made it more irritating rather than less. "I've been doing this since I was 12 years old," she said. "My father taught me. Your father's horses weren't Ghost." She turned around then, because she wanted to make sure he could see her face clearly when she said what she said next. "I am not made of glass, Samuel, and I am not a child. And I would appreciate it if you would allow me to make judgments about things I am actually capable of judging." He looked at her. He was not angry, she could see that clearly, but he was not entirely comfortable either. And the discomfort was doing interesting things to his expression, moving through it in ways she was slowly getting better at reading. "All right," he said after a moment that felt slightly longer than a moment. "But if she moves wrong, you step away, immediately." "I know how to step away from a horse. I know you do. I'm asking you to promise me." The shift in those last 3 words from instruction to request was subtle but real, and it registered. "Fine," she said. "I promise." She turned back to the mare. Ghost pressed her nose briefly against Clara's palm, warm and dry and deliberate. Behind her, she heard Samuel exhale a long, slow breath that carried more than just air in it, and then his footsteps, going back the direction he had come. She stood there with the mare and thought, he was afraid for me. Not afraid of being wrong, afraid for her. That was different. She filed it. By the time she came in for dinner that evening, something had shifted in the cabin. Not dramatically nothing, between them was dramatic, which was itself one of the things she was slowly learning to appreciate, but noticeably. Samuel had made a meal that was slightly more elaborate than usual, which she was coming to understand was his version of a peace offering, and when she sat down and he set a plate in front of her, he said, without preamble, "You were right." She looked up. "Ghost was listening to you," he said. "I watched from the door of the barn for a while after. You know what you're doing." Clara held the compliment carefully. "The way you hold something fragile that you didn't expect to be given." "Thank you," she said. "Your father taught you well," he added, and then he sat down and picked up his fork. The subject was closed, but not in the way subjects were closed when they were being avoided. In the way subjects were closed when they had been fully said. She thought about that later, about the difference. About how much communication could happen in the negative space around words, in what was not said but was present anyway. Pete noticed something the next morning. He had the kind of perception that came from years of watching people navigate difficult situations, the watchfulness of a man who had learned that paying attention was a form of kindness. When Clara came out to help with the morning feeding, he looked at her with a slight smile and said, "You held your ground." She raised an eyebrow. "With the boss," he said. "Yesterday. I saw it from the south fence." He was being overprotective, she said. Yes, Pete agreed pleasantly. He was. He paused, filling a feed bucket with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He doesn't do that for nothing, you know, the overprotecting. He glanced at her sideways. Last hired hand who got badly hurt on this property, Samuel drove him 40 miles to the doctor himself. Sat in that waiting room for 6 hours. Boy wasn't even his blood. He was just his responsibility. Samuel takes responsibility seriously. Clara was quiet, absorbing that. He carries a lot, Pete said. Not sadly, just as information, she said. Pete nodded once, and went back to his bucket, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't, really. It planted something. The understanding of Samuel Carter did not arrive in a single revelation. It built the way of fire, built one thing at a time, each addition small, the heat increasing. So gradually you didn't feel it until you were genuinely warm, and couldn't remember being cold. She began to see the patterns. He woke first, always, regardless of how late he had worked. He did the first round of the property before breakfast, not because he didn't trust his hands, but because he believed that person responsible for a thing should be the one to check on it. He kept a small ledger separate from the ranch account, where he noted things. A widow in the nearest town who was low on wood, a neighboring family whose fence had come down in last week's wind, the Harrison boy who had been thrown by ghost, and who had, Clara discovered, received a month's wages from Samuel while he was recovering, with no announcement and no expectation of acknowledgement. She found out about the wages by accident, from Pete, who mentioned it the way people mention things they assume you already know. He didn't tell me that, Clara said. No, Pete said. He wouldn't. She thought about that for the rest of the day. The town of Ridgemont was 12 miles from the ranch, a real enough distance in Montana territory that it was not a casual trip. Samuel went every 2 weeks for supplies, and on the 3rd week of her residence she asked to go with him, expecting that he might find a reason to discourage it, and ready with arguments about why she should be allowed. He said, of course, we'll leave at first light. No argument. No hesitation, just of course. She was not sure why she had expected resistance. She had been bracing for it without evidence. That was what weeks of being told you had no choices did to a person. It taught you to preemptively fight for things you hadn't yet been denied. Ridgemont was a real town, not large but substantial, a proper main street with a general store, a feed and grain, a small hotel, a saloon that was boisterous at all hours, and a post office that doubled as the information exchange for the entire Northern Valley region. There was also a church and a school and a doctor's office, and the whole arrangement had the comfortable industriousness of a place where people had decided to stay. Clara knew, before they arrived, that people would look at her. She was the woman who had appeared on Samuel Carter's mountain ranch, the forced bride, the girl no one had expected to actually show up. She had prepared herself for stairs. What she had not fully prepared herself for was the quality of the stairs. They were not mostly unkind. They were curious. Some of them were something closer to sympathetic. A few women on the main street looked at her with an expression she recognized after a moment as recognition, the recognition of people who understood, from their own lives or their daughters' lives, what it meant to have a future and for you by other people's decisions. One woman, a sturdy, direct-eyed woman of about 45 named Mrs. Eleanor Ford, who ran the general store with the efficient competence of someone who had decided very early in life not to waste energy on things she couldn't change, came around the counter when they entered and looked at Clara with the frank assessment of someone who had very little time for pretense. "You're the Carter girl," she said. "Clara Carter," Clara said, and the name still sat oddly in her mouth, but she said it straight. "Mrs." Ford looked at her for a long moment, then at Samuel, then back at Clara, and something in her expression relaxed, not warmly, not sentimentally, but with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting to make a judgment and has now made it. "You need anything," Mrs. Ford said, "anything the ranch doesn't have or the man doesn't know, you come see me. I'm here." It was not a grand gesture, It was 3 sentences from a practical woman in a hardware-smelling store. But Clara felt it like something that had been held out in an open palm. "Thank you," she said. "I will." Samuel, across the store loading his list, said nothing. But she noticed, when they left, that he nodded to Mrs. Ford in a particular way, not the general, civic nod of passing acknowledgement, but something more specific, something that looked like, "Thank you for that." On the way back up the mountain, the wagon loaded, and the light going long and golden, Samuel said, Eleanor Ford delivered both her daughters alone. Her husband was caught in a storm 2 counties over. She did it herself and then went back to work 3 days later. Clara absorbed this. "She told you this?" she said. "She doesn't tell anyone anything," he said. "Pete's been in this valley 20 years. He knows things. A beat. I tell you this because I thought you should know what kind of woman just offered to help you." Clara looked at the mountains ahead of them. "The kind who doesn't offer unless she means it," she said. "Exactly that kind," he said. They rode in silence for a while, comfortable silence, the kind that had a different quality now than the silence of their first wagon ride together. That first silence had been 2 strangers calculating the terms of their situation. This one was something else, 2 people who had learned enough about each other to be quiet without needing to fill the space. "Samuel," she said. "Yes, why do people in town say those things about you?" She felt him look at her from the side. "That you're cold, that you're strange, that you're wrong, somehow. I've been here 6 weeks and I don't see it." A long pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. "When Daniel died," he said finally, "I stopped going to town for about 2 years. I just stopped. I couldn't do the things you were supposed to do after a loss. The sympathies, the talking about it, the being seen to be grieving the right amount in the right way. I couldn't." His voice was level, but she heard what was underneath it. "And when I came back, I'd missed 2 years of the ordinary social machinery. The shared references, the common events, the way a community builds a shared language without meaning to. I was behind by 2 years, and I didn't know how to catch up, so I stopped trying to catch up." Clara listened. "People read that as coldness," he said. "It wasn't. I didn't know how to be around people who hadn't lost what I'd lost, and I didn't know how to explain why I didn't know, so I stopped trying to explain." She held that for a moment. Then, "That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard." "Yes," he said simply. "It was a beat. It isn't now," he said. And then, as if the sentence had surprised even him, he was quiet. Clara looked at the road ahead. The mountains were turning purple in the long light. The horses' hooves were a steady sound against the earth. She did not say, "I'm glad." She did not say, "Neither is mine." But she thought both things, clearly and without qualification, and she believed he knew she was thinking them. The 7th week brought the first real crisis. It announced itself on a Tuesday morning. The way bad things often did, not with drama, but with the quiet arrival of a stranger at an inconvenient hour. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, different from the horses she knew by sound, faster, with the particular urgency of a ridden animal rather than a working one, and then Pete's voice outside, and then a voice she didn't recognize, and then Samuel's voice, low and carefully controlled in the way it got when he was processing something he did not like. She waited. She had learned that waiting and listening was not weakness. It was intelligence. 5 minutes later, Samuel came inside. His face was arranged, deliberately, carefully arranged, the way a face got arranged when the person behind it was preventing the face from doing what it wanted to do. "What happened?" she said. He looked at her, and she saw him make the decision to tell her, which, she noted, the decision to tell her, rather than manage her. "A man named Richard Holloway has been buying land in the valley," he said. "He's been at it for about 2 years, quiet about it, using different names and different agents. One of the Birch family's boys just rode over to tell me that Holloway's man was in Ridgemont yesterday, filing some kind of preliminary claim." Clara felt something sharpen inside her. A claim on what? "On this valley." He said it steadily, but she heard the thing underneath. "On the mineral rights, underneath it, specifically. There's iron in this mountain, apparently. Maybe more than that." Holloway's been doing surveys. Can he file a claim on land you own, she said. Not if the ownership is clean and documented, he said. But Holloway's a man who knows how to find the complications in things. He'll find the complications. He looked at her directly. I need to get my papers together. Every deed, every tax record, every chain of title going back to when I first filed. If there are any gaps, he'll find them. Clara was already moving toward the storage room before he finished the sentence. I've seen your files, she said over her shoulder. Where exactly do you keep the land documents? He followed her to the doorway. The flat box on the middle shelf. Why? She looked at him. Because my father taught me to read land documents when I was 14 years old, she said, and he taught me to find the complications before other people found them. So let me look. Samuel stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't fully read, something that was partly surprise and partly something else, something more complicated. Clara, he said. Samuel, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to, a bit, also I'm quite good at it, so. Something moved across his face that might, if she had been in a more interpretive mood, have been the beginning of a smile. Middle shelf, he said. Flat box. There are 2 of them, take both. She took both. What she found in those documents over the next 3 hours was alternately reassuring and alarming. Samuel's core ownership was solid. The original filing was clear, the tax records were consistent, the property lines were documented with the care of someone who had always understood that land in Montana Territory was contested by nature and needed to be protected by precision. Her father would have approved of the record-keeping. But there was a gap, small, the kind of thing that could be dismissed or explained, but a gap nonetheless. A period of 6 months in 1877, when the property tax records were incomplete, not absent but incomplete, the result, she determined after careful reading, of a county records office fire that had damaged half the files from that period. Samuel's records had been partially restored from copies, but the restoration documentation was thin. That was where Holloway would go. She was certain of it. She brought the documents to Samuel at the kitchen table and spread them out and showed him exactly what she had found, pointing to the specific gap, explaining what it meant and why it was vulnerable. He listened without interrupting, following her finger across the pages, and she watched his expression move from focus to recognition to the particular grim set of a person who had just confirmed a fear. He'll use that, Samuel said. Yes, she said, he will. How do you fix it? You find the copies, she said. Original copies, not restorations. Tax payments, receipts, correspondence with the county, anything from that period that proves continuous possession and payment. It won't fully close the gap, but it narrows it enough that a court would need a reason to prefer his claim over yours. Samuel was quiet, staring at the documents. I might have some of that in the old strongbox, he said slowly. In the barn. I haven't gone through it since. He stopped. Since his family died, she understood. Then we go through it, she said. He looked at her. We, he said. We, she confirmed. Another one of those pauses that had something moving underneath them. After supper, he said finally. We'll go through it after supper. The strongbox was in the back of the barn in a locked chest that took Samuel 2 minutes to locate the key, for he had not, she realized, opened this chest in a very long time. Inside was the detritus of his life before the winter that had taken his family, letters, receipts, a child's drawing that was probably Daniel's, tax notices and payment stubs and correspondence with the county surveyor that predated the fire by 3 years. And at the bottom, rubber banded together and preserved by the dryness of the barn, a set of original tax receipts covering every year, including the gap period, signed by the county tax collector, stamped with the county seal. Clara picked them up and held them carefully, as if they might dissolve. These are exactly what you need, she said quietly. Samuel reached out and took them from her, gently, and looked at them for a long moment, and she saw something move through his face, not just relief, but something older and more complicated. The expression of a man holding a piece of his past that he had not expected to hold again. My father kept everything, he said. He used to drive me crazy with it. Every receipt, every notice, every piece of paper from the county. He said. His voice changed slightly, in the way voices change when they're quoting someone who is no longer alive to say the words themselves. He said, a man who couldn't prove what he'd done might as well not have done it. Clara looked at him. He was right, she said softly. Samuel nodded once. He was looking at the receipts, but she thought he was seeing his father. She let him see his father. She stood very still and let the moment be what it needed to be without rushing it towards something else. After a moment, he folded the receipts carefully and put them in his breast pocket. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past 7 weeks, the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being grateful and wasn't quite sure what to do with the feeling. Clara, he said. Don't, she said, not unkindly. I was going to say. I know what you were going to say. She picked up the old strongbox lid and fitted it back into place. And you don't need to. We just did what needed doing. A beat. We, he said again. The single word as before, but she heard something different in it this time, not surprise. Exactly. Something closer to acceptance. We, she said again. Firmly. They walked back to the cabin in the dark, and the stars were extraordinary over the mountain, and neither of them said anything more, and it was enough. 2 days later, Pete came back from Ridgemont with more information. Holloway's man, an agent named Croft, smooth and well-dressed, and possessed of the particular confidence of someone accustomed to winning, had been asking questions around town about Samuel. Not about the land directly, about Samuel, about his character, his history, his relationships. He's building a picture, Pete said, setting his hat on the table and looking at Samuel with the level eyes of a man delivering news he doesn't like. Making it about you as a person, not just about the papers. What kind of picture? Clara said. Pete glanced at her, then back at Samuel. The kind that says a mountain man who lives alone with no family and no connections to the community is the kind of man who might have gotten his land by ways that don't hold up to scrutiny. That's nonsense, Clara said. It's nonsense with a lawyer and a strategy behind it, Pete said. Samuel was quiet. He had his hands flat on the table. She had come to understand this as his posture of controlled thinking. The physical stillness that meant the inside was very much not still. He wants to make this about who I am, Samuel said. Not what I own, yes, Pete said. Samuel looked at his hands. Then he looked at Clara, and she saw it just for a moment, just a flash, the thing he didn't show easily, fear. Not of Holloway, not of losing the land. Fear of the specific story. Holloway was building the story that said Samuel Carter was a man without roots, without connections, without a claim to belong to anything or anyone. It was the story his own grief had partly built for him. And Holloway had found it. Clara felt something move through her, not pity. She knew he didn't want pity, but something harder and cleaner than pity. A kind of fierce recognition. She had been told a story about her own value by people with an interest in diminishing it. She knew what that felt like. She knew exactly what that felt like. Then we changed the picture, she said. Both men looked at her. If he's asking around town about who you are, she said, then the answer to that question matters. Mrs. Ford, the Birch family. The Harrison boy you paid a month's wages when he was hurt. She looked at Samuel steadily. You've been quietly helping people in this valley for years, without anyone knowing it was you. Well, now they should know. I don't want Samuel started. I know you don't want recognition, she said. This isn't about recognition. This is about letting people you've helped have the chance to say so. That's not charity, that's truth. She held his gaze. Let people tell the truth about who you are. The silence that followed had a different texture than their other silences. It had the texture of a man reckoning with a version of himself. He hadn't considered a version that existed in other people's memories and experiences and debts of gratitude. A version built from all the quiet things he had done without keeping score. He had built those things carefully, consistently, for years. He just hadn't thought of them as a foundation. She's right, Pete said, with the simplicity of someone stating the obvious. Samuel looked at Clara for a long time. She could see him working through it, The instinctive the deeper understanding that there were things worth fighting for, and one of them was sitting at this table. "All right," he said finally. Clara nodded, picked up her coffee, took a measured sip. Outside, the mountain was doing what mountains did, vast and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the small human drama being conducted at the kitchen table. But inside the cabin, something had shifted again, and this shift was larger than the ones before it. She had arrived on this mountain expecting loneliness. She had arrived expecting to be managed, contained, reduced to the narrow space allowed to a girl who had been traded for debt relief. Instead, she had found herself, 7 weeks in, sitting at a table, with a man who listened when she spoke, a ranch hand, who had become something close to a friend, and a problem she was genuinely capable of helping to solve. She had found herself useful. She had found herself respected. She had found herself, in the most literal possible sense, necessary, not in the way women were told they were necessary, as providers of domestic comfort and acceptable social presentation, but in the way that her specific mind, her specific skills, her specific inheritance, from a man who taught her to read contracts at 14, was necessary to the man sitting across from her. Her father had given her those skills, without knowing what she would need them for. She thought, he knew anyway, she thought, thank you. And later that evening, when Samuel sat down at his own desk and began writing letters to Mrs. Ford, to the Birch family, to neighbors and ranchers and people he had helped over the years, asking quietly if they would be willing to speak to his character if the time came, Clara sat near the fire and worked through the tax documents again, checking and rechecking the chain of title, building the argument piece by piece, with her father's careful, methodical precision. They worked in the same room and said very little, and the fire was warm, and the mountain was quiet outside. And the document case that held Samuel Carter's claim to his land and his history was growing stronger with each page she organized and each letter he sealed. She did not know yet what this feeling was, this specific combination of engagement and safety and purpose, and the particular warmth of being alongside another person's struggle and meaning it. She did not have language for it yet, but she knew it was something she had not expected to find here. And she knew she did not want to lose it. She pressed her pen to the next page and kept working. The letters Samuel wrote went out on a Thursday. By the following Monday, the first response had already come back. It was from Eleanor Ford. She didn't write a letter. She wrote out herself, which was a 12-mile trip on a horse she had owned for 15 years. And she arrived at the ranch in the late morning with the particular expression of a woman who had decided something and saw no reason to delay the execution of her decision. She tied her horse at the post, walked to the cabin door, knocked once with the brisk confidence of someone not accustomed to being turned away, and when Clara opened it, Mrs. Ford looked at her with those direct, measuring eyes and said, "Is he here?" "He's in the south pasture," Clara said. "I can send Pete." "You'll do," Mrs. Ford said, which Clara understood to mean, "I came to talk to you as much as to him." "May I come in?" She came in. She sat at the kitchen table with her hat still on and her coat still buttoned, because she was not staying long. And she put both hands flat on the table and looked at Clara, with an expression that had something urgent moving underneath its surface. "Holloway's man was in my store again yesterday," she said. "Croft, the one who smiles too much. What did he want?" Clara said. She was already pouring coffee, because Mrs. Ford's energy required something to do with her hands. "He wanted to know about you," Mrs. Ford said. Clara set the coffee pot down carefully. "Me, you specifically." Mrs. Ford's jaw was tight. "He asked who you were before the marriage. He asked about your family, about the debt situation, about the," she paused with the particular pause of someone editing for kindness, "about the circumstances of the arrangement." Clara felt something cold move through her, separate from the temperature of the room. "He's going to use me," she said. It was not a question. "He's going to try to use the story of you," Mrs. Ford said. "The way it looks, a girl brought up from a debt situation, no family standing, a forced arrangement. He wants to make Samuel look like a man who takes advantage of desperate circumstances. And he wants to make you look like someone who has no real stake here, no real claim, no real. She stopped. No real right to be here, Clara finished. Mrs. Ford looked at her steadily. Yes. Clara sat down across from her. She felt the cold thing moving through her, settle somewhere specific, not in her chest, where the stone had lived for months, but somewhere harder and more combustible. Something that had more heat than cold in it. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I was busy, Mrs. Ford said. And then I rode out here. She picked up her coffee. Because what I actually have to say, I'd rather say to you than to a lawyer in a suit. Then say it. Holloway's strategy is to make this valley think that Samuel Carter is not what he appears to be, Mrs. Ford said. That the quiet, isolated man up on the mountain has something to hide about his land, about himself, about his marriage. He needs people to doubt Samuel before the legal challenge lands, so that when it does, the community is already uncertain. She looked at Clara directly. The question is what we do about that. Clara thought about the tax documents. The letters Samuel had written. The careful structure she had been building, piece by piece, over the past 2 days. She thought about her father, standing at the kitchen table, with a contract spread in front of him, running his finger down a column of numbers and saying, "The fraud is never in the obvious place. It's always in the margins." "How well do you know the other landowners in the valley?" Clara said. Mrs. Ford's eyes sharpened. Well enough. Well enough that they'd talk to you honestly about what Holloway's been doing. Most of them. Some of them have already been approached by his agents. One of them sold. Mrs. Ford's voice tightened slightly on that last word. Didn't know what he was selling, I think. Just saw a good price and took it. Clara was nodding slowly. If Holloway's been buying parcels using different names and different agents, she said, then each seller only saw one transaction. No one saw the pattern. That's right, but if you put them in a room together, they'd see the pattern. Mrs. Ford set down her coffee cup with a decisive little click. You're your father's daughter, aren't you? Clara looked at her. Did you know him? Heard of him? Thomas Whitmore. A man who knew what a contract was actually saying. She nodded with what seemed like approval. It's a rare skill in a man. Rarer still in a girl of 18. She stood up and buttoned her coat, which she had never unbuttoned. The business of the visit concluded in her mind. I'll talk to the valley landowners. You keep working on your papers. We'll need both. She was at the door when Clara said Mrs. Ford. The older woman turned. Thank you, Clara said. For riding 12 miles. Mrs. Ford looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not quite warmth, but was something adjacent to it. Something that understood what the words were actually saying, and chose to receive them fully. You're one of ours now, she said simply. That's what we do. She left. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of her horse leaving and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, the specific warmth of belonging. Not to Samuel, not yet or not only, to something larger. To the fabric of a place that was deciding, through the actions of a woman in a coat and a hat on a 12-mile horse ride, to include her. When Samuel came in from the south pasture, and she told him what Mrs. Ford had said, he listened the way. He always listened completely still, no interruption, his whole attention organized in the direction of what she was saying. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's going to come after you, Samuel said, Holloway. He's going to try to make you the weakness. I know, she said. Clara. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was working to say something he didn't say easily. I brought you into this. Whatever happens, with the land, you didn't agree to be part of this fight. I don't want you to feel like you have to, Samuel. She said his name with the same calm finality he sometimes used with her. Stop. He stopped. I am standing in my kitchen, she said. In my home, talking about my land. She held his gaze. Do you understand what I'm telling you? A long beat. Yes, he said quietly. I do, then let's get back to the documents. He sat down, she sat down. They went back to the documents. Croft arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the letters went out. He arrived without announcement in a buggy that was too expensive for Montana Territory roads, wearing a coat that was also too expensive for Montana territory, anything, with the smooth self-presentation of a man who used his appearance as a tool. He was perhaps 45, well-fed, with an easy confidence in the set of his shoulders that came from having operated for years in situations where money and connections solved most problems before they fully. He found Samuel at the fence line, mending a section that had come down overnight, and he got out of his buggy with the relaxed unhurriedness of someone who believed he controlled the pace of every interaction he entered. "Mr. Carter," he said pleasantly, "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Samuel said without looking up from the fence. A brief pause, a man recalibrating. "My employer is Richard Holloway," Croft said. "You may have heard the name. I've heard it." Samuel fitted the wire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had mended 10,000 feet of fence. "State your business." Croft's tone shifted, almost imperceptibly pleasant still, but with something flatter behind it now. "Mr. Holloway has an interest in this valley, specifically in the mineral potential of the northern ranges. He believes there may be an opportunity for mutual benefit." "There isn't, if you'd allow me to explain the terms." "Mr. Croft." Samuel set down his fence tool and looked at the man directly for the first time. His voice was level, his expression was controlled. And Clara, who had come around the side of the barn when she heard the buggy and had positioned herself where she could hear, without being immediately visible, recognized the specific quality of Samuel in full command. Of himself, which was a formidable thing to witness. "I know what your employer has been doing in this valley. I know how many parcels he's bought, and how many names he used to buy them, and I know why the names were different. I know about the county filing, and I know about the story you've been building about me in town." A pause. "So let me save us both some time. This land is not for sale. The documentation supporting my ownership is complete. And if your employer intends to challenge that in court, he will find that the challenge is considerably more difficult than he has planned for." Croft looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his pleasant expression, reassessment, rapid and careful. "Mr. Carter," he said, with a slightly different register now, something that might have been genuine. "My employer is not a man who accepts." "I'm not interested in what your employer accepts," Samuel said. "Good day." He picked up his fence tool and went back to the wire. Croft stood there for a moment, and Clara, from her position, watched him do the calculation, whether to push further, whether this was a front that would crack under additional pressure, whether the man mending the fence was bluffing. He was not bluffing. You could see it from anywhere close enough to watch his hands. Croft got back in his buggy. Before he pulled away, he looked toward the barn directly. It seemed to Clara, toward her position, as if he had known she was there all along, and his expression was not threatening exactly, but it was specific. A look that said, "I see you, and this isn't finished." Then he drove away. Clara came out from the side of the barn and walked to the fence line. Samuel was working the wire again, his hands steady, his face still arranged. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Samuel said, "or he'll try something else." "Yes." She stood beside him for a moment. "You did well," she said. He glanced at her. "I told him to leave." "You told him to leave when you already knew everything he was going to say before he said it," she said. "That's different. That's showing him the strength of your position without explaining it." Samuel was quiet. "Then your father really did teach you everything." "He taught me what he could," she said. And then, because she was thinking it, and she had decided some time ago to say things she was thinking, "I think he knew I was going to need it." Samuel looked at her with that expression, again the complicated one she was getting better at reading, the one that had gratitude and admiration and something more personal, all moving through it at once. "I think he was right," Samuel said. The escalation came faster than either of them expected. 4 days after Croft's visit, Pete rode back from Ridgemont with his face, in the particular way it got when the news he was carrying was worse than he had hoped. "Holloway's filed the challenge," he said, before he was fully off the horse. Samuel came out of the barn. Clara came out of the cabin. "Already," Samuel said. "Already. Pete pulled a document from his coat, a copy, obtained from someone at the county office, who owed Pete a favor, of the formal challenge Holloway had filed with the territorial court. He's claiming that your ownership of the north parcel, the one that backs up to the mineral range, was improperly registered during the gap period in '77. He's got a lawyer in Helena, good one, apparently. Clara took the document from Pete before Samuel could reach for it. She read it standing there, quickly, moving through the legal language, with the focused attention of someone who had been trained to find the specific weight-bearing wall inside a structure of words. She found it within 2 minutes. He's not actually claiming you didn't own it, she said, without looking up. He's claiming the registration was defective, that the county records from '77 are insufficient to establish continuous ownership, and that therefore the mineral rights, which were filed separately by his agent last month, take precedence. Can he do that? Pete said. He can try, Clara said. She was still reading, but the argument only works if we can't produce direct evidence of ownership during the gap period. She looked up at Samuel. The receipts from your father's strongbox. They cover the gap period, Samuel said. Every quarter, she confirmed, but we need to get them authenticated. Officially, we need someone with legal authority to establish that they're genuine and that they predate Holloway's claim. She looked at the document again. How far is Helena? 2 days' ride, Samuel said. 1.5 if you push. Then someone needs to go to Helena, she said, with the receipts and the deed and the chain of title documentation. To see a lawyer. I'll go, Samuel said. No, Clara said. Both men looked at her. If you leave now, Holloway's people will know within a day, she said. And while you're in Helena, they'll be in this valley, doing whatever the next step of their strategy is. You need to be here. She kept her voice level. Pete can take the documents to Helena. Pete nodded slowly. I can do that, but I'm going to write down exactly what to say and exactly what to ask for, Clara said. And I'm going to need 3 hours with the documents tonight to make sure the package is complete. Pete looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Clara. The exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds. 3 hours, Samuel said. You have it. She had 4, in the end, because Pete didn't leave until the following morning, and she used every minute of the evening organizing, annotating, and writing a clear account of the ownership history that any territorial lawyer would be able to follow without needing to be an expert in county records. She had her father's gift for making complex documentation legible, and she used it without restraint. When she handed the leather case to Pete, at first light, he took it with both hands and looked at it with the seriousness of someone receiving something valuable. Don't let it out of your sight, she said. Not for a second, he said. She watched him ride out, and then stood there for a moment, in the early morning quiet, and she thought, please. Just please. She was not sure exactly who she was asking. Her father, maybe. The mountain. Whatever larger thing was responsible for the timing of things in this world. Please let it be enough. Samuel came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They watched Pete's figure get smaller against the enormous landscape until he was gone, and then they went back inside. Now we wait, Samuel said. Now we work, she said. And while we work, we wait. He looked at her. Is there a difference? There's a significant difference, she said. Come on. The next 2 days were the strangest of Clara's time on the mountain ranch. Strange because she was waiting for something. She could not control Pete's ride, the lawyer in Helena. The machinery of territorial law turning at its own pace, without her hands on it, and the waiting had a particular quality she did not like. It was the quality of a situation where she had done everything she could with what she had, and now the outcome depended on things outside her. She had spent her whole life in situations like that. She had not gotten better at the waiting part. She threw herself into work. She helped with the horses, including Ghost, who had progressed to tolerating the new saddle blanket with something approaching equanimity. She reorganized the kitchen inventory she had begun weeks ago and completed it with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. She read every remaining document in the property files twice. She wrote a detailed account of Croft's visit from memory, timing and wording and specific phrasing, because her father had taught her to document interactions with adversaries while they were fresh. On the evening of the first day, Samuel found her at the kitchen table with 3 documents spread in front of her and an expression he apparently recognized because he said, gently, "Clara, stop for tonight. I'm almost Clara." She looked up. He was standing at the table with 2 cups of coffee, and he set one in front of her, with the quiet deliberateness of someone placing something important. "Come sit by the fire," he said, "just for an hour. The documents will be there tomorrow." She looked at the documents. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "1 hour," she said. "1 hour," he agreed. They sat by the fire, and for the first hour she said very little, and he said very little, and the fire was warm, and after a while she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to do something other than what it had been doing for 2 days. Not go away, it didn't go away, but shift, change texture, become something more manageable. "Tell me about your father," Samuel said eventually quietly, in the tone he used when he was asking something real. She thought about it. "He was a practical man," she said. "He loved practical things. He thought that if you understood how something actually worked, really worked, down to the mechanism of it, then you had the best possible chance of making it work the way you needed it to." She paused. "He applied that to everything: contracts, horses, farming, people." She looked at the fire. "He used to say that most people are just mechanisms you haven't understood yet." "Did he believe that kindly?" Samuel asked. "Or clinically?" She smiled, and it was a real smile, one of the ones she couldn't engineer. "Kindly," she said, "completely kindly. He found people interesting. Like puzzles he wanted to solve, because solving them made them work better." She paused. "He would have found you interesting. Would he have approved of me?" Samuel said. Directly, carefully, she looked at him. "Yes," she said. Without hesitation, "He would have approved of you." He was quiet. She watched something move through his face, a softening, not of weakness, but of the particular kind of relief that comes when you have been uncertain of something important, and suddenly become less uncertain. "Why?" he said. "Because you're exactly what you appear to be," she said. He valued that more than almost anything, a beat. "And because you've never once made me feel like an inconvenience." The fire crackled. Samuel looked at his coffee. His jaw moved slightly the way it did when he was holding something he wasn't sure whether to say. "You are the least inconvenient person I have ever met," he said finally. She laughed, an actual laugh, short and surprised. "That's either a very high compliment or a very low bar." "High compliment," he said firmly, and then, with a sincerity that had no protective covering around it, "very high." She looked at him across the firelight, and something happened in that moment. Something she didn't immediately reach for a name for, because naming it would require deciding what it meant, and she wasn't ready for that yet. But it was real and warm and entirely unlike anything she had expected to find on this mountain. She looked back at the fire. "We should go over the timeline one more time," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. The letter arrived before Pete did. It came on the 3rd morning, carried by a rider from Ridgemont who looked tired and important simultaneously, and it was addressed to Samuel Carter in a hand she didn't recognize. She was the one who took it from the rider, and she carried it inside and put it on the table and stood looking at it for a moment, before Samuel came in from outside. "Letter," she said. "I don't recognize the hand." He came to the table and picked it up and looked at the return mark. Something changed in his expression, rapid, tightly controlled. "It's from Holloway," he said. She hadn't expected that. "Open it," she said. He opened it. He read it, standing at the table, and she watched his face the way she had learned to watch his face for the movements underneath the control, for the tells that revealed what the surface was trying not to show. What she saw was complicated. She saw something that started as anger and moved through a series of adjustments and landed somewhere she couldn't immediately identify. He put the letter on the table without speaking. She picked it up and read it. Holloway had written, or had his lawyer write, The language had the particular smoothness of legal crowdfunding, a settlement offer. Not aggressive, not triumphant, worded with the careful civility of a powerful man who had decided that appearing reasonable served his interests better than appearing predatory. He was offering to purchase the north parcel, the mineral rights parcel, at what he described as a generous price. He was offering to leave the rest of the ranch untouched. He was framing it as a resolution that protected Samuel's home and livelihood while allowing Holloway's interests to be satisfied. It was on its surface a generous offer. It was also, Clara understood immediately, a trap. "He's scared," she said. Samuel looked at her. "This letter is not from a man who thinks he's going to win in court," she said. "This letter is from a man who has just realized that his strategy is weaker than he thought." She put the letter back on the table with a precise little motion. "Pete is in Helena. Holloway's lawyer in Helena knows that." Someone told him, she thought rapidly. "He's trying to settle before the authentication happens, because once those receipts are officially authenticated, his challenge collapses, and he knows it." Samuel stared at the letter. "If we accept this," he said slowly, "we lose the mineral rights permanently," she said. "And we set a precedent that his challenges have force. He'll come back for something else, within a year. If we refuse it, we go to court," she said, "with our documentation. And we win. A beat." "You're certain?" he said. Not doubtfully, he was asking because he respected her certainty when she had it and wanted to understand its foundation. "I'm certain about the documents," she said. "I'm certain about the legal argument. I'm certain that his challenge depends on the gap period, and our documentation closes it." She looked at him. "What I can't be certain of is whether a territorial court will have the integrity to rule on the evidence." She paused. "But I think they will. And I think Mrs. Ford's people will make enough noise in this valley that ignoring the evidence will be difficult." Samuel stood very still for a long moment. She could see him weighing things she could see, and things she couldn't, the risk of loss, the cost of a fight, the weight of what this land meant to him, and what losing it would take. Then he said, "Write the response. Tell him no." She held his gaze for a moment. "You're certain?" She said his question back to him. Same tone, same foundation asking. "I'm certain," he said. "This is my family's land. Daniel grew up here." His voice was quiet and final. "I am not selling any part of it." Clara sat down and pulled paper toward her and picked up the pen. She wrote the response in 15 minutes, polite, legally clean, unambiguous. Declining the offer, noting that the ownership documentation was being authenticated through proper territorial channels. Thanking Mr. Holloway for his interest in the valley, and wishing him well in his future endeavors. The last sentence had a slight edge to it that was not quite detectable as an edge unless you knew exactly where to look. She signed it Clara Carter and passed it to Samuel without comment. He read it. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. The last line, he said. "Too much," she said. "No," he said. "Exactly right." He folded it and sealed it and set it aside for the writer to take back. Then he looked at her across the table, and the thing she had seen in the firelight the previous evening was there again, clearer now, less guarded, standing more fully in the light. "Clara," he said. She waited. "I need you to know something," he said. "Whatever happens in court, whatever the outcome." He paused, and she could see him choosing the words with the care he gave to important things. "You have changed this place." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "You have changed me, and I want you to know that I see that. That I know what it cost you to be here, and that I am another pause. More grateful than I know how to say." Clara held that. She held it the way she had held the tax receipts from the strongbox, carefully, with an awareness of how fragile and how valuable the thing in her hands was. "You gave me somewhere to be," she said finally. "When I had nowhere." She kept his gaze. "That's not a small thing. Don't let anyone tell you. It's small thing." He nodded once, and his jaw was tight, and she understood that he was at the edge of what he could hold with composure. "Get back to work," he said. "Get back to work," she agreed. Pete rode back in late that same afternoon, dusty from 2 days of hard riding, his expression too controlled for the news to be bad. He came through the door and put the leather case on the table and sat down heavily in the nearest chair and looked at both of them. "The lawyer's name is Hargrove," he said. "William Hargrove. He says the receipts are authentic beyond any reasonable question. He says the chain of title is the cleanest he's seen in 10 years of territorial law practice." Pete looked at Samuel. "He says if Holloway's challenge reaches the court in Helena, it will be dismissed." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Clara put her hand flat on the table. Samuel closed his eyes for one moment, just one, and when he opened them, they were clear and steady. "Good," he said. "There's more," Pete said. "Hargrove sent a letter directly to Holloway's lawyer." "Professional courtesy," he said, "but I think what he actually meant was a warning. That if they proceed with the challenge, knowing that the documentation has now been authenticated, they're potentially in contempt territory." Pete looked at Clara. "He said whoever organized those documents saved about 6 months of work." Clara said nothing. She picked up her coffee and took a measured sip, and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing done well, landing exactly where it was supposed to land. Outside, Ghost nickered at something from the direction of the barn. The mountain was enormous and silent in the late afternoon light. Somewhere in Helena, a lawyer named Hargrove had put a wall between Samuel Carter's land and the thing that had been coming for it. And in the kitchen of a cabin, on a mountain in northern Montana, a girl who had arrived as an unwanted burden was sitting at a table with 2 men who looked at her with something that, by any honest accounting, was respect. She had not expected to find herself here. She was not sure anymore that she wanted to be anywhere else. Hargrove's letter to Holloway's lawyer landed in Helena on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, the formal challenge had been quietly withdrawn. There was no announcement, no apology, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. That was how men like Holloway operated. They arrived, with noise and pressure and manufactured momentum, and when the ground shifted under them, they simply redirected, smoothly and without ceremony, as if the original direction had never been their intention. Croft's expensive buggy did not appear on the ranch road again. The inquiries around Ridgemont stopped. The name Holloway, which had been moving through the valley like weather for weeks, simply ceased to circulate. Pete heard about the withdrawal from the county clerk's office on Wednesday afternoon, and rode back to the ranch with it, and when he told them, standing in the main room with his hat in his hands, and an expression of quiet satisfaction on his face, the 3 of them were briefly silent in the way people are silent when something they have been afraid of against suddenly removes itself and the body hasn't caught up to the absence of the weight yet. Samuel sat down. Clara noticed that the sitting down, which was not something Samuel did in the middle of the day. He sat in the chair by the table and put his hands on his knees and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. "It's done," Pete said. "Not a question, it's done," Samuel confirmed. His voice was even, his face was controlled. But Clara, who had spent 4 months learning to read the language underneath Samuel Carter's surface, could see the thing moving through him, a slow, deep release, like a river going back to its proper banks after a flood. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen and came back with 3 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down, and Pete sat down. And the 3 of them sat with their coffee in the middle of the afternoon and didn't talk for a while, and that was exactly the right thing. After Pete left, the cabin was very quiet. Samuel was still at the table. Clara had moved to the fireplace, not because she needed the warmth, but because she needed something to do with her hands, and tending a fire was something to do with your hands. She built it up and then sat back and listened to the quiet and waited. "My father bought this land in 1861, Samuel said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the table, at his coffee cup, or maybe at something past both of those things. He came up from Missouri with $30 and a horse that was worth more than the $30. He worked 3 winters for a man named Elias Birch, Old Birch, the grandfather, before he had enough to file the claim." He paused. He used to say the land wasn't the point, the land was just the proof. Proof of what? Clara said. That he had stayed, Samuel said. That he had not left when it was hard. That he was the kind of man who stayed. He looked up at her. He wanted us to be that kind of people, stayers. Clara held that word. You are, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Because of you, he said. This time, she shook her head. Because of yourself. I just helped you find the paperwork. Clara. His voice had the quality it got when he was putting weight on a word. You know it was more than the paperwork. She did know. She had known for a while. Yes, she said, I know. The silence that followed was the most honest silence they had shared, yet two people sitting with the truth of something between them, not trying to minimize it or organize it into something more manageable, just letting it be the size it was. I have something to ask you, Samuel said finally. She waited. When your relatives arranged this marriage, he said, carefully, you had no choice. You came here because you had nothing else. He kept his eyes on her. I want you to know that I understand that I have always understood that. And I want you to know that if you had decided, at any point, that you wanted to leave, that this life was not what you wanted, or that I was not, he stopped. Started again, I would have helped you go. I want you to know that. I would have helped you have what you needed. To build something else. Clara looked at him steadily. I know that, she said. I've known that since the first week. Then I want to ask you, he said. And his voice was doing something she hadn't heard it do before, something that had no protective covering around it at all. Fully exposed the way the truth is exposed, when a person decides that the risk of saying it is worth more than the safety of not saying it. I want to ask you to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because the arrangement requires it, but because he stopped. Because, she said quietly, an invitation for him to continue, not a completion. He looked at her with everything he had, no walls, no management, no careful control, just Samuel Carter, fully present, asking for something he had not allowed himself to want for 8 years. Because I cannot imagine this place without you in it anymore, he said. Because you are the most real person I have met since I lost my family. Because when you're in the room, everything functions better, including me, he paused. And because I think I am, he stopped again. Say it, she said. Gently, firmly, I think I am in love with you, he said. And I don't know what to do with that, except tell you the truth of it and let you decide what it means. The fire was warm, the cabin was quiet. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did, enormous, indifferent, ancient, and inside this small room, something that had been building for 4 months, was now fully, irreversibly present. Clara felt it move through her, not surprise, because she had known for some time that this was where the geography of the last months had been heading, had known it in the way you know a destination before you arrive. The recognition that precedes the arrival, but something larger than recognition. Something that answered. I came here expecting a prison, she said. Her voice was steady. I came here expecting a man who would own me. I came here ready to spend my life being manageable and quiet and invisible in the way women are told to be manageable and quiet and invisible when they have no power. She paused. And instead I found a man who taught me that the first thing you do for a person is give them room to breathe. Samuel was very still. I don't know exactly when it happened, she said. Maybe when I watched you teach that boy how to fix a harness. Maybe when you said Daniel's name and let yourself be seen. Maybe when you sat up all night with those documents and never once made me feel like I was doing more than my share. She held his gaze. But at some point, Samuel, I stopped staying here because I had no choice. And I started staying because I couldn't imagine leaving. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, not relief or not only. Something bigger than relief, so she said. The answer to your question is yes. I choose to stay, not because of the arrangement, not because of where I came from or what I have or don't have, but because she felt herself smile, real and unguarded, the smile she had not had access to for much of the past year. Because you are exactly what you appear to be, and my father raised me to know how rare that is. Samuel stood up from the table, and crossed the room to the fireplace and stood in front of her. And for a moment he simply looked at her, this girl who had arrived frightened and sharpened by loss and had turned out to be the strongest person he had met in years. And she looked back at him. And what passed between them in that look was everything that 4 months of silence and honesty and shared work had built, laid out fully in the space of a few seconds. He took her hand, both of hers in both of his, carefully, the way you hold something you know has value. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for choosing this." "Thank you," she said, "for making it worth choosing." It was not the ending of something. It was the beginning of something that had been quietly assembling itself from the first morning she had stood in the doorway with her coffee and watched him teach a young ranch hand how to fix what he had broken. But sometimes beginnings needed to be recognized, named, given their proper weight. This was one of those times. The news moved through Ridgemont the way news moved through small Montana towns, not announced, not posted, but distributed through the organic channels of people who noticed things and mentioned them to other people who also noticed things. Mrs. Ford heard it from Pete. The Birch family heard it from Mrs. Ford. Within a week, everyone who had watched the Holloway situation with concern and the Carter marriage with their varying degrees of skepticisms had absorbed the updated information. The challenge had been withdrawn. The land was secure. And the woman on the mountain ranch was, by all available evidence, exactly where she intended to be. The reaction was not dramatic. Montana Territory in 1882 was not a place that made much of drama. But the quality of how people looked at Samuel Carter when he came to town changed. Something that had been withheld, some final reserve of community confidence, was released. He had been defended. He had been seen, and the people who had helped defend him had done so because they chose to, not because they were required to. For Samuel, who had spent 8 years believing that connection was a thing you lost and didn't recover, this was not a small thing. He didn't say that to Clara directly. He didn't need to. She had watched his face in Ridgemont, 2 weeks after the withdrawal, when Mrs. Ford had come out from behind her counter and shaken his hand with both of hers and said simply, "Glad it came out right," and seen what moved across his face in the moment of that contact. And she filed it in the place where she kept the important things. What she did not expect was what happened 2 weeks after that. Her Aunt Ruth arrived. She came without announcement, which was itself a statement. The announcement would have given Clara time to prepare. And Ruth had apparently decided that preparation was not in her interest. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a hired buggy, dressed with the careful respectability of a woman who was very conscious of how she appeared, and she found Clara in the yard, coming back from the chicken coop with a basket of eggs. Clara saw her before Ruth saw her, which gave her exactly 3 seconds to decide how she was going to be. She decided how she was going to be. "Aunt Ruth," she said when she was within comfortable speaking distance. Not surprised, not cold, simply present. Ruth turned and looked at her, and Clara watched her aunt's expression do several things in rapid succession: appraisal, adjustment, something that might have been relief or might have been calculation, and then the practiced pleasantness of a woman who had decided on her approach in the buggy. "Clara," she said. "You look well." "I am well," Clara said. A pause. Ruth looked at the basket of eggs, then at the yard, then at Clara again. "May I come inside?" Ruth said. "Of course," Clara said. She made coffee, because making coffee gave her something to do, and gave Ruth time to arrange herself, and they sat at the kitchen table in the cabin that Ruth had imagined, Clara understood, would be rougher and smaller and more difficult than it was. "The farm has been sold," Ruth said, once the coffee was in front of her. "The creditors are satisfied. There's a small remainder, not significant, but something. It's yours." She pushed an envelope across the table. "It should have been given to you at the beginning. Gerald and I," she paused. "We handled things quickly. Perhaps too quickly." Clara looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. "Perhaps," she said. Ruth's hands moved slightly on the table, a small involuntary adjustment that Clara recognized as discomfort. "I wanted to see how you were," Ruth said, And then, with what appeared to be genuine difficulty, I worried. Afterward, I didn't want to worry at the time, because worrying would have meant reconsidering, and the arrangement it was the practical solution. It was, Clara said. For your purposes, Ruth absorbed that. Yes, she said quietly, for our purposes a pause. And for yours it turns out, I hope. Clara thought about how to answer that. She thought about the version of herself who had sat in the kitchen of her father's house 3 days after his death and heard the phrase, at least, someone is willing to take you. She thought about the version of herself who had ridden toward these mountains, expecting loneliness and diminishment. She thought about the version of herself who had found, instead, a man who gave her room to breathe and problems worth solving, and a community that had decided to include her. She thought about all of those versions and understood that they were not separate people. They were the same person at different points on the same journey, and the journey was not finished. It turns out, she said yes. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was complicated and tired and, Clara thought, genuinely sorry in a way that Ruth probably didn't know how to make larger than it was. "You're not going to make this easy for me," Ruth said. "No," Clara said, "I'm not. A beat, but I'm not going to make it hard for you either. You did what you thought was necessary. It caused me pain. Those two things are both true." She picked up the envelope from the table and held it. "I'll keep this. It was my father's." Ruth nodded. They finished their coffee. Ruth looked around the cabin with eyes that were taking things in, the organization of it, the cleanliness, the evidence of a home that functioned well and was cared for. Clara watched her aunt process the information and arrive at the conclusions the information led to. When Ruth stood to leave, she said, "He's good to you?" "Yes," Clara said, simply. Ruth nodded again. She put on her coat with the methodical movements of someone coming to terms with something. "Your father," she said at the door quietly, "he would have hated the arrangement." She paused. "But I think he would have been glad about how it came out." Clara held the door. "I know he would have been," she said. After Ruth's buggy disappeared down the ranch road, Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, and the feeling that moved through her was one she recognized from another moment, the morning after Hargrove's letter, when she had sat in the kitchen and understood that the thing she had been bracing against had removed itself. The release of weight, the return to proper level. She was not reconciled with her aunt. She was not erasing what had happened. But she was also not carrying it the way she had been carrying it, not as a fresh wound, not as an open thing. It was becoming something else, something that had happened, that she had survived, that had led her here. She went back inside. She put the envelope in the flat box with the land documents, where important things were kept. Samuel came in from the barn at midday and read her face. He was very good at reading her face by now, better than most people who had known her for years, and said, "Someone was here." "My aunt," Clara said. He waited. "She brought the remainder from the farm sale," Clara said. She apologized, in the way people apologize when they need to apologize but aren't entirely sure how. A beat. "I let her." Samuel poured himself coffee and sat down. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, because it was true, "better than I expected to be." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He asked nothing more, which was exactly what she needed. She sat across from him, at the kitchen table, and thought about her father's money in the envelope, in the flat box, and about Aunt Ruth's complicated eyes, and about the word stayers that Samuel had used, and about the boy Daniel, who had been 10 years old and followed his brother everywhere, and about Ghost the mare, who had finally accepted the new saddle blanket, and about Pete, who had ridden 40 miles to Helena with a leather case that held the weight of 8 years of Samuel's life in it. She thought about all the things that had moved through this cabin and this mountain in the past 4 months, and she thought about what they added up to. They added up to a life, a real one, with actual people and actual difficulties and actual moments of grace distributed among the harder things in the specific proportion that real life used, not evenly, not predictably, but genuinely. She had not expected a real life. She had expected an arrangement. She had braced herself for the narrow version of existence that was available to women who had no choices and instead she had encountered a man who handed her choices from the beginning, and she had made them, and they had led her here, to this table, to this coffee, to this quiet Wednesday afternoon, with the fire going and the mountain outside, and Samuel Carter across from her reading something, and occasionally looking up in the way he did when he was checking that she was still there. She was still there, Samuel, she said. He looked up. I want to do something with the money, she said. The farm remainder. He waited. There are families in this valley who are struggling, she said. I know of at least 3, from what Mrs. Ford has mentioned. Families where the harvest was bad, or the winter was hard, or someone was sick at the wrong time. She looked at him. I want to do something practical with it, not charity. She felt strongly about that word. Not charity, investment, in people who would use it well, and know that someone believed they would. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then your father taught you that. He practiced it too, she said, quietly. I only understood it after he died, when people came to the funeral who I'd never met and told me stories. About things he had done. She paused. He never told me. He just did it. Samuel looked at her with the full-weight expression, no management, no distance. The one she had come to understand was the realist version of him. I know a family, he said, the Hallorans, south end of the valley. 3 children. He broke his arm in September, and they've been managing, but barely. Tell me about them, she said, and she picked up a pen. It was a Wednesday afternoon in March of 1883, 4 months and some days into a marriage that had been arranged by people with other things on their minds, and at the kitchen table of a cabin on a mountain in northern Montana. A woman who had arrived expecting to disappear was making a list of people to help. Her handwriting was like her father's, slightly cramped, efficient, precise. The fire was warm, the mountain was outside, and Samuel Carter watched her write and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 8 years, not with noise, not with ceremony, but with the quiet definitiveness of a thing finding its proper place after a long time of being somewhere that wasn't right. He thought, she is the most real person I have met since I lost my family. He thought she chose this. He thought so did I. He picked up his own pen. The Hallorans, he said, and there are 2 others. Let me tell you. She looked up and nodded, pen ready. And they worked, side by side, at the kitchen table, in the March light, building something that was not just a ranch and not just a marriage, but something larger and more durable than either a life that had been chosen, freely, by 2 people who understood what it meant to have had no choices and had decided together that the people around them deserved better than that. Outside, Pete was doing something in the barn that involved cheerful and off-key whistling. Ghost had finally, definitively, accepted the new saddle blanket. The chickens whose names, Clara, was still learning, moved through the yard with the important efficiency of chickens everywhere. It was ordinary, completely, genuinely, beautifully ordinary. Neither of them had ever been more grateful for ordinary in their lives. Clara finished her list and looked at it. 7 names, 7 situations. The beginnings of 7 small interventions that would not change the world, but would change the specific gravity of 7 specific lives in the northern valley of Montana Territory. Her father's money, her father's methodology, her father's belief that the practical application of kindness was the highest use of whatever you had. She folded the list and put it in her pocket. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Samuel said. We'll start with the Hallorans. She stood up from the table and went to the fireplace and built the fire up for the evening, and Samuel put his papers away and went to start supper, and the cabin filled with the sounds and smells of a household that had found its rhythm, and outside the mountain held its ancient position against the sky, enormous and indifferent and completely unchanged by the small human story that had been unfolding inside it. But the story was not small. It only looked small from the outside. From the inside, from the kitchen table and the fireplace and the space between 2 people who had learned each other, slowly and honestly, and without pretense, it was exactly the size it needed to be. It was the size of a choice freely made, and that was the largest size there was. The Hallorans were not what Clara had expected, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern in this valley, that people were consistently more and different than what she had been told to anticipate. Tom Halloran was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with an arm still wrapped and splinted, an expression that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing on diminished capacity for too long and knew it and was too proud to say so. His wife, Margaret, answered the door, with a child on her hip and two more visible behind her. And she looked at Clara and Samuel standing on her step with the careful eyes of a woman who had learned that unexpected visitors sometimes brought problems dressed as solutions. "Mr. Carter," Margaret said. "Very polite, Mrs. Halloran," Samuel said. "This is my wife, Clara. We've come with something we'd like to discuss, if you'll allow it." The word wife still did something to Clara when Samuel used it, not discomfort anymore, but the opposite of discomfort, a small internal recognition, like a key finding its lock. They were invited in. Margaret made tea with the automatic hospitality of a woman who fed people regardless of what else was happening in her life. Tom sat at his table and did not apologize for the state of anything which Clara respected. The children, a girl of about 7, a boy of 5, and the one on Margaret's hip who was perhaps 2, observed the visitors, with the frank assessment of children who had not yet learned that staring was considered impolite. Clara explained it directly, because she had decided on the drive over that directness was more respectful than delicacy. The farm remainder, her intention, the specific understanding that this was not charity, but a practical extension of the same logic that governed any good community, that people helped people. Because the people they helped today were the people who helped others tomorrow, and the circle was the point. Tom Halloran's jaw tightened while she talked. She watched it and understood it. A man's pride in the presence of his family's difficulty was a fragile and important thing, and she was not trying to damage it. "It's not mine to give away," she said, before he could speak. "It's my father's, and my father was a man who believed that money sitting in an envelope was money failing at its purpose." She looked at Tom directly. "He would have done this himself. I'm doing it for him." Tom was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Samuel. "She always liked this," he said. "Since the first week," Samuel said. Tom looked back at Clara. Something in his jaw loosened, not gratitude yet, but the precondition for gratitude, the willingness to receive. "What are the terms?" he said, practically, which was exactly the right question. "Bring," Clara said, "when your arm is right and the season opens. Whatever you can manage. If the season's bad, we talk again." She held his gaze. "The term is that you pass it forward when you're able. Not to us, to the next person who needs it." Margaret made a small sound from across the kitchen. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that comes out when something hits a place that has been under pressure for too long. Tom Halloran looked at his wife, then at his hands. Then at Clara. "All right," he said. On the way back to the ranch, Samuel drove and Clara sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while. The silence had the quality of something shared, rather than something empty. "Your father would have done exactly that," Samuel said. "I know," she said. "The part about passing it forward." "That was his," she said. "I just remembered it in time." He reached over without looking at her and put his hand briefly over hers, where they rested in her lap. Just a moment, just a touch. The kind of contact that said everything it needed to say, in the time it took to say nothing at all. She turned her hand over and held his for the rest of the drive. Spring came to the northern valley with the particular enthusiasm of Montana Springs, which was to say aggressively and without apology, arriving suddenly after a winter that had seemed determined to be permanent. The ranch woke up the way ranches woke up in spring, with noise and urgency, and 100 things that needed doing simultaneously. And Clara moved through it with a competence that was no longer surprising to anyone, including herself. She had learned the rhythm of the ranch across a full winter. She knew which horses needed what. She knew the supply schedule and the relationship with the Ridgemont merchants and the specific ongoing negotiations required to keep a working property functioning at the level Samuel maintained it. She knew Pete's habits, and the names of all the chickens, and the particular sound Ghost made when she was genuinely calm versus when she was performing calm, which were different sounds and mattered. She also knew by April that she was going to have a child. She knew it before she was certain of it, the way bodies communicate important information slightly ahead of confirmation. She sat with the knowledge for 4 days before she said anything, not from fear, but from the particular privacy of needing to be sure of her own relationship with a thing before she offered it to someone else. When she told Samuel, it was an ordinary evening. She had planned nothing elaborate. She simply said, after supper, while he was reading, and she was mending something that needed mending, "I think we're going to have a baby." He looked up from his book. He went very still, in the way he went still when something important was happening, and he was processing it at full capacity. "Think," he said. "Am certain," she said. The think was a courtesy. He put the book down. He looked at her with an expression. She had no fully satisfying word for something that was joy and terror and wonder, all occupying the same space, at the same time, each of them real, none of them canceling the others out. "Clara," he said. "Samuel," she said. He was across the room in 3 steps, and she stood up and he held her, really held her. With the careful and complete steadiness of a man who understood that the person he was holding was the most important thing in his current universe, and she felt his hands against her back and his face against her hair, and the specific quality of a person who had been alone for a long time and was no longer alone, finally, permanently no longer alone. "Daniel would have been a terrible uncle," he said into her hair. His voice was unsteady in a way she had never heard it before. She laughed, unexpected, real, the kind of laugh that comes from the chest. "The absolute worst," she agreed. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His eyes were bright. He was not pretending they weren't. "I am so," he started, stopped, tried again. "I don't have the word for it." "Neither do I," she said, "but I think that's all right." He kissed her then, and she kissed him back, and outside Pete was doing his evening rounds. With the cheerful obliviousness of a man who did not yet know that the world had just changed, and the mountain held its position, and the stars over Montana territory were beginning to come out in the way they did, in April tentatively at first, then all at once. Pete found out the following morning. He received the news with the expression of a man experiencing genuine and unguarded joy, and he said well, and then said nothing else for a moment, which was the most Pete had ever communicated in 2 syllables. "Well," he said again, "and then that's the best news this ranch has had since he stopped." His voice did something careful, "since I can remember." Clara looked at him. "Since before Daniel," she said quietly. Pete met her eyes, nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Since before Daniel." Something passed between the 3 of them in that moment, an acknowledgement of all the years, between then and now, the long stretch of loss and isolation and slow, patient rebuilding. The recognition that what was beginning was connected to what had been lost in the way that living things are always connected to what came before them. It was, Clara thought, the way her forefather would have wanted her to understand it. The news moved through the valley on its own, the way news did, and the response it generated was another thing she had not expected, or had not let herself expect. People came, not all at once, not in a formal way, but singly and in pairs, with practical gifts and straightforward congratulations, and the specific warmth of a community that had decided, over the preceding months, that the Carters were its own. Mrs. Ford came with a bolt of fabric, and the information, delivered as fact rather than offer that she had delivered more babies in the Northern Valley than the doctor had, and was available. The Birch family sent their eldest daughter with a basket of preserved goods and a handwritten note that Clara read twice and then kept in the flat box with the important documents. The Hallorans' Tom's arm healed, and his spring planting underway, sent a letter in Tom's careful, unpracticed handwriting that said simply, "We heard. We're glad." Clara read that letter at the kitchen table and felt the circle her father had described close, at least partially, at least for now. The summer was full and complicated and real. The ranch ran at capacity. Pete hired 2 additional hands for the season. Young men who learned quickly and worked hard, and ate enormous quantities of whatever Clara put in front of them, which was itself a kind of satisfaction. Ghost foaled in June a dark gray colt with his mother's alert eyes, and Clara was there for it, and afterward stood with her hands on the fence and felt the particular awe of watching something new arrive in the world. Samuel came to stand beside her. He looked at the foal, and then at Clara, and then at the foal again. "We should name him," he said. "He needs a few days first," Clara said. "You can't name something until you know what it is." "That's very philosophical for a horse." "Everything deserves to be known before it's named," she said. "It's basic respect." He was quiet for a moment. "Then your father again?" "My father," she confirmed. They named the colt Thomas 6 days later, and did not discuss why, but both knew why, and the knowing without discussing it was itself a form of intimacy. The twist that Clara had not foreseen arrived in July from a direction she had entirely failed to anticipate. It was not a threat this time. It was not Holloway or a legal challenge or an external force organizing itself against them. It arrived in the form of a letter from the territorial government, a formal letter addressed to Samuel, with the kind of official weight that comes from decisions made by people with authority over large amounts of land. The government was establishing a land grant program for homesteaders in the Northern Territories. They were looking for established ranchers with documented ownership, good standing in their communities, and the capacity to serve as anchor properties, essentially. Stable ranches that smaller homesteading families could orient around as they established their own claims. The program offered a significant expansion of registered land in exchange for a commitment to support new arrivals in the valley, assistance with first-season challenges, guidance on documentation, access to established supply relationships. It was an opportunity, an enormous one. It was also a responsibility of a size that made Clara sit with the letter for a long time before she said anything. "This is what we built toward," Samuel said when he had read it. "Whether we knew it or not. It's a commitment," she said carefully. "We'd be responsible for people who don't know this land, who don't know what the winters are like or how to manage the supply runs, or we'd teach them," he said. She looked at him. "The way you taught the Harrison boy to fix a harness. The way Pete taught me things when I was young and stubborn and too proud to ask questions," he said. "The way your father taught you." He paused. "The way things get passed forward." She looked at the letter. She thought about the Hallorans, about Mrs. Ford's 12-mile horse ride, about Pete sitting at this table with his hat in his hands, delivering news he didn't like, about a small wooden box on a back shelf with a child's shoe inside it and the name Daniel, and the way grief and love occupied the same space in a person, and the only difference between them was time. She thought about arriving on this mountain, expecting to disappear, and finding instead something she had not known to want. She thought about what it meant to build a place where people could find that. "Yes," she said. Samuel looked at her. "We say yes," she said. "We do it." He picked up the letter and read it again, slowly, and she watched his face as he read the face of a man, looking at something that his father would have recognized, that Daniel would have grown up inside of, that was continuous with everything that had come before it, and open to everything that would come after. "We'll need more fence," he said. "We'll need more everything," she said. "Pete's going to complain. Pete is going to be magnificent and complain the entire time," she said. "It'll be fine." Samuel put the letter on the table and looked at her across it with the full-weight expression, the one with no management, no distance, everything present. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, without preamble, without setup, just the fact of it, laid on the table like the letter, like the tax receipts, like every other important document that had passed between them. It was not the first time he had said it. He had said it in various forms since March. In the particular way, he said important things not often, not carelessly, but with full weight when he said them at all. Each time she heard it, it registered differently, added a new layer, became more true rather than less with repetition. "I love you," she said back, same simplicity, same weight. He nodded once, as if a thing had been confirmed, and picked up his pen to write the response to the territorial government. She picked up her own pen and began making a list of what they would need. The first homesteading families arrived in September. 3 of them, initially the kind of families that answered government land grant programs, which was to say people who were willing to risk comfort for the chance at something they owned, who carried in their wagons and on their faces the specific combination of hope and fear that characterized people standing at the beginning of things. Clara met the first family, the Wades, with 4 children and a grandmother who had the sharp eyes of someone who had survived many previous beginnings at the edge of the ranch property and showed them to the parcel that had been prepared for them with the same directness she had used with the Hallorans. "The winters here are harder than you've been told," she said when they were standing on their land. "That's not to discourage you. It's so you prepare correctly. The first winter is the important one." Mrs. Wade, a woman of about 35 with practical hands and practical eyes, looked at her steadily. "What do we need to know?" Clara told her. Everything she had learned in a year on the mountain. The supply schedule, the things that failed in cold, and the alternatives. The relationship with Ridgemont, and the specific merchants who were reliable. The signs that weather was turning before it turned. The way the valley behaved in the season she now knew by feel as much as by knowledge. She talked for 45 minutes without stopping. Mrs. Wade listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Mrs. Wade's, "How long have you been here?" "A little over a year," Clara said. "And before that?" "I was 18 and had nothing," Clara said. "And I was brought here by an arrangement I didn't choose." She held the other woman's gaze. "And I want you to know that, because I want you to know that when I tell you this valley is worth it, I'm telling you that from a place that knows exactly what it costs and chose it anyway." Mrs. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then she extended her hand, woman to woman, the specific handshake that meant "I understand you and I trust you," which was different from the handshake that meant "nice to meet you." Clara shook it. "Thank you," Mrs. Wade said. "Thank Pete more than me," Clara said. "He's the one who knows where the warmest firewood comes from." By the following spring, 2 years into their marriage, 6 months after the baby arrived, the Carter Ranch was something different than it had been. Not unrecognizable. Still the same land, the same timber buildings, the same mountain enormous and indifferent above it. But around it, and from it, something had grown that had not been there before. The baby's name was Thomas Daniel Carter, and he had arrived in January in a snowstorm that Pete declared was the most inconvenient possible timing, and Mrs. Ford declared was a fine time because she was there, and everything was proceeding correctly. He arrived with the full-throated opinion of someone who had a great deal to say, and intended to say it immediately, and Samuel, standing at the bedside with his sons in his arms for the first time, looked like a man who had discovered something he had forgotten was possible. He looked at Clara. She was exhausted and entirely present, the way she was always entirely present. "Thomas Daniel," he said, confirming it, holding the name. "Thomas Daniel," she confirmed. He looked down at his son, this child, whose grandfather had kept every receipt, whose great-uncle had followed his older brother everywhere, whose parents had found each other on a mountain in the worst possible circumstances and made something worth finding. And Clara watched his face with the careful attention she had been giving it for over a year now, and what she saw there was not complicated. It was simple, the simplest thing. He was home. The valley changed around them in the way that valleys change when people are paying attention, slowly, incrementally, each season adding something to what the previous season had built. The homesteading families established themselves and then helped establish each other. The Wades, by their second summer, were the ones meeting new arrivals at the edge of their property and doing the same 45-minute explanation that Clara had given them, adjusted for what they had learned by living it. That was the pass it forward, made visible. That was the thing her father had understood and had tried to practice quietly for the length of his abbreviated life. Thomas Daniel Carter grew up on a ranch where people came and were helped and left better than they arrived. and he grew up understanding this as normal, as the basic operating logic of human beings in community, as the obvious and unremarkable way that the world should work. He grew up watching his father teach and his mother organize, and both of them make decisions together at the kitchen table, with coffee and documents, and the occasional heated disagreement that resolved itself before supper in the reliable way that disagreements resolved when both people at the table valued honesty more than victory. He grew up knowing that his parents' marriage had started out with love, which they told him plainly when he was old enough to understand plainly, because they were not people who constructed comfortable stories over uncomfortable truths. "Then how did you love each other?" he asked once, at an age when such questions were newly available to him. Clara and Samuel looked at each other across the kitchen table. Their version of the full-weight look, the one that had more history in it now than it had in the beginning, deeper and more layered, richer for everything that had passed through it. Slowly Samuel said, "And by paying attention and by being honest," Clara said. Even when it was uncomfortable, Samuel added, "Thomas thought about this." "That sounds hard," he said. "It was," Clara said. "And it was the most worth it thing I have ever done." He accepted this in the way children accept information from parents. They trusted not uncritically, but as a foundation from which to build his own understanding. It was enough. Pete grew old on that ranch and made no secret of his intention to continue doing so. His hair went fully gray and then fully white, and his face accumulated the evidence of decades of Montana weather. And he maintained his habit of cheerful and off-key whistling during the morning rounds, and his gift for showing up exactly when something needed saying and saying it in the fewest possible syllables. One evening, when Thomas Daniel was perhaps 8 years old and had just done something that required conversation about choices and consequences, Pete found Clara outside afterward and stood beside her, in the particular way Pete stood beside people when he had something to contribute. "He's going to be all right, that boy," Pete said. "I know," Clara said. "He's got your brains and his father's steadiness." A pause. "And your father's that particular thing your father had. The way of seeing what something actually is, instead of what it appears to be." Clara looked at him. "You never met my father." "No," Pete said. "But I've watched you for 2 years. The apple didn't go far." She felt the familiar thing, the particular warmth that came with the mention of Thomas Whitmore, the man who had taught her to read ledgers and love honestly and pass things forward. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "I'm going to check the south fence," he said, which was Pete's version of "you're welcome," and he went. She stood alone for a moment in the evening air, and she thought about the girl she had been 18 years old, and standing at the minister's house in her wedding dress, while her Aunt Ruth cried for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and she thought about what that girl had been expecting, what she had braced for, what the weight of her circumstances had told her was coming. She thought about all the distances between then and now, and she thought, "He was right, my father, about all of it. The mechanisms and the kindness and the pass it forward and the idea that people are worth understanding before they're named. He was right that a person's value was not set by their circumstances, not by debt or by loss or by an arrangement made without their consent, not by the stories other people told about them in towns where they were not present to contradict, not by the worst thing that had happened to them or the most powerless moment they had experienced. She had been traded. She had been reduced to a solution to other people's problems. She had been told, in so many words, that someone was willing to take her, as if that willingness was the highest value she could hope to achieve. And from that beginning, they had built this. Not perfectly, not without difficulty or conflict or seasons that were harder than others. Not without moments of fear and grief and the specific work of two people learning to share a life without losing themselves in the sharing. But genuinely, completely, with the full-weight honesty that she had come to understand was the only kind worth having. She went back inside. Samuel was at the kitchen table with Thomas, who was doing something with a piece of paper that appeared to be the beginning of a drawing. and was being narrated to his father in the comprehensive detail that 8-year-olds applied to their own creations. Samuel was listening with the same full attention he gave everything, no performance, no distraction, genuinely interested in the paper and the narration and the small human being producing both. Clara stood in the doorway and watched. She thought, this is what it looks like when something is built right. She thought, I want to remember this specific moment for the rest of my life. She thought, I am so glad the wagon went up the mountain. Samuel looked up from the drawing and found her in the doorway, and his expression did the thing it had been doing for 2 years now. That particular settling, that arrival, the face of a man recognizing the person who makes the room, makes sense. Come see this, he said. He's drawing the ranch. She crossed the room and stood behind Thomas and looked at the drawing. It was the ranch as seen by an 8-year-old, big on the horses, approximate on the buildings, Pete represented by a stick figure of somewhat heroic dimensions. There was the mountain behind it all, enormous and slightly lopsided. There were chickens. There were small figures that were, Thomas explained, the families who lived on the surrounding parcels. In the center of it, clearly the center, 2 figures standing side by side. Taller than everything else, named at the bottom in careful, unpracticed letters. Mama, Papa. Clara put her hand on her son's head. She looked at Samuel. He was already looking at her. No words were needed. None of the available words were adequate anyway. There was just this, a kitchen table in a cabin on a mountain, a drawing of a life built from unlikely materials, a woman who had been traded and had become indispensable, a man who had been alone and had become the center of something, and a child who would grow up believing that kindness was the obvious way to move through the world, because it was the only way he had ever seen modeled. Clara Whitmore had arrived on this mountain, with nothing, expecting nothing, prepared for the worst version of what a life could be. What she had found, and built, and chosen, and fought for, and loved, and passed forward was the answer to every low expectation ever set for her. And it was given not in argument, but in the irreducible daily evidence of a life fully, freely, and completely lived. She had been given no choice at 18. By 20, she had made more choices than most people made in a lifetime, and every one of them had mattered, and every one of them had been hers. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all.